My first example is post-primary. That's lower and upper secondary. The context for this particular model of the ELP was this. I had money, quite a lot of money, to run a research and development project which we called the CLCS, Centre for Language and Communication Studies, Learner Autonomy Project. I had funding for 4 years, which enabled us to recruit volunteer teachers who were interested in exploring this idea of learner autonomy and things one might do to develop it. And more important, I could also pay for serious research to be done in classrooms. The aims of this project at a practical level were to get learners to accept responsibility for their learning. I don't know how it is here in Sweden, but in Ireland, whenever you talk to teachers, they say, all very well for you to talk, my learners are so unmotivated. Look, if my students are walking down the corridor in the Arts and Social Sciences building in Trinity College and they're unmotivated, that's their problem. In my lecture room, if they remain unmotivated after 2 minutes, that's my problem, and arguably my fault. We also wanted to foster the use of the target language in the classroom. We wanted to help teachers to develop their planning skills. One of the first things that we discovered when we began to work with teachers on this project was that their pre-service education and various in-service courses they'd been able to attend had never ever focused on planning. Lesson plans, of course, but planning for a week or a month or a term or a year or a 3-year course had not been part of anything they'd done. And we wanted to look for a new way of teaching for the exams, because that's what they do in Ireland. Exams are very, very important. But what happens, of course, is that too much of education becomes practicing doing exams. And we designed our ELP model as a means of promoting greater learner involvement and responsibility, as a means of focusing attention on the development of communication skills, as a means of facilitating teacher planning, and as a means of stimulating positive interaction between teaching learning processes and syllabus and exam objectives. In the passport section of our post-primary ELP, we have an introduction which explains what the passport is and how it's meant to be used. We have the standard adult passport. This is a standard version of the passport that was developed collaboratively by the pilot projects towards the end of that phase of pilot projects, in order that there would be a pre-validated passport component available for all ELPs, for adults and older adolescents, upper secondary, in order to give the ELP concept from an early stage in general implementation a sort of European identity. But we also have an interim or process passport that gives personal information, a profile of language skills, self-assessment of course, language learning and intercultural experiences, and enables owners to list certificates and diplomas. In the language biography, we have again an introduction. We have general aims and reflections. In other words, from time to time, users of this model are invited, obviously interactively with one another, obviously stimulated and supported by their teacher, to reflect on what it is they think they're up to. We gave them a checklist of target skills, in other words, those checklists of descriptors, for the 4 levels covered by this ELP. It runs from A1 to B2, but we gave them in the 5 curriculum languages, which are Irish, French, German, Spanish, and Italian. And we did that because of this philosophy of target language use. There's no point in having a European language portfolio which is, as far as its dynamic section is concerned, entirely in the mother tongue. If I'm trying to teach someone German, I want them to interact with me, and I'm certainly going to interact with them through German. And therefore, we need checklists in German, and we need to think of using those checklists, I can do this, I can do that, as a means of beginning to develop a sort of metacognitive, metalinguistic awareness in the learners. We have general goal-setting pages. My next learning target is this. The date I'm going to try to achieve it by is thus and thus. And then comments on it and what I think I've learned. Things I notice about language and culture. How I solve communication problems. Methods I use to learn languages. Intercultural experiences. And all of these pages are designed for recursive use. In other words, you don't fill them in just once. How did we design this ELP in relation to the curriculum? Well, at the core of the language biography are those detailed checklists of target skills. They're derived from the illustrative scales in the Common European Framework. If you look at the framework, you'll find there are 35 different illustrative scales that expand the summary descriptions in the self-assessment grid in relation to different domains of language use. But we also analysed the communicative objectives of the official curriculum. Some of them were explicit, some merely implicit, and we had to draw them out. So we rephrased communicative objectives as can-do statements. We classified them according to the framework's 5 skills. And we sequenced the targets in terms of the levels A1 and A2, B1 and B2. And we came up with what analysis of other lower and upper secondary curricula around Europe also came up with, that typically curricula have goals at A1 and A2 for lower secondary and B1 and B2 for upper secondary. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we deceive ourselves. The problem is that in our curricula anyway, some of the communicative goals, the things that kids are expected to be able to do in speaking, but especially in writing their target language by the time they are school leavers, are way ahead of anything they can possibly develop as a matter of internalized communicative competence through interaction in the classroom, even supplemented by holidays abroad. One of the things that I'm urging on our authorities in Ireland, which probably means nothing will be done, is that we should look very closely at the Common European Framework, not as a way of saying, oh, our curricula are B2, but rather look at the framework and say, look, what do we really think it's possible to achieve with our kids over 3 years or 5 years or whatever, and adopt appropriate goals that then make sure that we achieve them. Curriculum topics and exam tasks. This was a way that our teachers in our project got into using the portfolio. One teacher created a very simple grid to keep track of her learners' coverage of curriculum topics and exam tasks. That's what it looked like. So the topics are vertically: meeting and greeting people, hobbies, sport, music, TV, careers, family and house, town and buildings, pets, animals and what they eat, weather conditions, school, favourite subjects, timetable. And she had this self-assessment thing of I can understand the vocabulary, I can write a paragraph or letter on the topic, I can understand the tape, I can have a conversation, and so on. And the smiley face means yes, I can do it. The sad face means no, I unfortunately can't. And the neutral face, well, on a good day I may just about be able to do it. But the same teacher used that checklist together with the more detailed checklists in the language biography as a way of driving target language communication forward from the beginning. In their first term, she got her kids to begin to write texts in French. Those texts were sometimes written by individual learners, sometimes collaboratively. So you get texts like the one up on the left, which is really just a little repetition of dans ma chambre, la moquette est rose, dans ma chambre, la mer est blanche, dans ma chambre, la table de nuit est noire, dans ma chambre, les murs sont jaunes, dans ma chambre, le papier peint est marron, dans ma chambre, les rideaux sont gris. What a horrible room it is. But apparently that was this learner's room. Whether it was the actual room, whether it was a room that was thought out in imagination, doesn't much matter. And then, of course, there would have to be, wouldn't there, attempts to write limericks. Il y avait une femme de Paris, et elle s'appelle Marie. Elle a parlé anglais. Elle a, mistake there, isn't there? Elle a détesté le soleil. Elle aime poisson. Merci. That's very much an Irish teenager's imaginative perspective on French culture. But what's interesting about it, of course, is that it shows immediately the deficiencies that have still got to be coped with in terms of the phonological system. So we don't worry about the mistakes that are there because learners make mistakes. That's what learning is about, especially in languages. But we can use those mistakes to focus on the phonological system and to try to find rhymes that are really appropriate. And that's more especially the case in the last example here. Il y avait une femme de Toulon et elle s'appelle Yvonne. Elle organise ses chaussures. Elle fait un séjour dans maison entre Lyon et Dijon. But at least these kids are trying to say something, and they're trying to say something witty. And the fact that they're sometimes collaborating but always exchanging means that these texts, however deficient, provide a foundational resource for communicating through French and about French and analysing French in the classroom. And in our circumstances, that's really quite something. The same teacher said to her learners, look, one of the things you've got to be able to do, according to the curriculum, but also according to the ELP, is give a simple description of someone. Well, they quickly decided that it wasn't going to be interesting describing one another. And one of them, probably satirically, because kids of 12 plus are not without a sense of satire, said, Miss, let's do the Simpsons. So they did the Simpsons, and they formed teams about 30 of them in this class, and they worked on their descriptions of different members of the Simpson family. Now this is after 3 months of French. Now, that's not bad, is it? 3 months of French. Homer Simpson, il est paresseux, il n'est pas sportif. Il est gros, il n'est pas mince. So, he's this, he's not that, is a good device for weeding out some French. Il est chauve, il est grand, il pèse plus de 200 kilos, il a 38, il est jaune, il adore manger, il n'est pas courageux, il adore bière, il n'est pas beau. Il est un père, un fils, Bart, et 2 filles, Lisa et Maggie. And so on, and so forth. But again, the point is not that there are all kinds of mistakes. The point is that there is the beginning of an underlying capacity to generate text in French. And one of the greatest benefits that the ELP brings, precisely because it involves writing down, is this constant toing and froing between speaking and writing, writing and speaking. Using written notes to support deficiencies in short-term memory in order to be able to communicate. Sitting around a computer with 3 or 4 learners trying to talk together a story into some kind of existence and writing it down. This is one of the most powerful ways of learning language that is available to man. Not surprisingly, educational systems have been slow to cop onto it. We, as I said, did some research into how the ELP was working in these classrooms, and 2 of my colleagues went into a number of classrooms and talked to learners about how they were getting on, and the learners showed them their portfolios, and these 2 girls who were talking to them, Tracy and Louise, wrote these things in their portfolios. My next target, all the rubrics in our portfolios are multilingual in all the curriculum languages, because the whole time we're trying to encourage the teachers and learners to be using French or German or Spanish or Italian, not dropping back to English to set targets, but it's in English for purposes here. So my next target, so Tracy says, learn the verb faire et les expressions avec faire, e.g. je fais les courses. This is because the teacher is insisting on telling them what they're going to do in French. Louise, not quite so adventurous, but says to learn the faire verb et les expressions faire, e.g. je fais les courses. And they're probably sitting copying from one another, but that doesn't matter. How well did I achieve it? Tracy says, I think I did well in the faire section of the test. I found it easy because we got the word cuisine and we found word triggers to help us. Word triggers, as you'll see, became a bit of an obsession with Tracy. But the idea that one word prompts another. This is the beginnings, you see, of metacognition, of metalinguistic awareness, of being able to do things in language because you understand explicitly how language works. Louise says, I thought I achieved it well, but I'm not that sure about the word before the noun, e.g. je fais mon lit. Well, that example shows she hasn't got a clue, doesn't it? I don't think I'll ever master it, but I did fairly well in the test. What have I learnt about myself or learning? Well, Tracy says, I think it easy when finding word triggers. I think it's important to learn the subject you're there doing. And Louise says, I've learnt that it's easier to learn if you resemble the word with the meaning. That's not English, but it is French, interestingly enough. And it's just possible that she's caught that. Second example, my next target, Tracy says, our target is the days, months and seasons, to learn the days, the months, the seasons. And Louise writes in, les jours, les mois, les saisons. How well did I achieve it? I feel it was very easy because they sounded like the same as the English. Eh? That's odd, isn't it? And I made a poster. I know the days very well, wrote Louise. The seasons were a bit hard, but I got them. The seasons are okay too. And Tracy says, I find it easy when you find word triggers. And Louise says, things are easy if you like learning. And then my colleague said to them, well, do you think having this ELP helps you learn French? They didn't all say it did, but those who did gave these reasons. 9 of them said, well, it helps me set targets and monitor my progress. So they'd latched on to the possibility of self-management that was generated by the ELP. The ELP helps me to learn French because I can see what I'm good at and not good at just by reading the targets. That's the checklists. And another kid wrote, the blue sheet, that was the thing we were looking at earlier, allows you to keep a record of your progress. 8 of them said, well, it helps me record work from which to revise. So in other words, you're building up the process of your learning for purposes of revision. Because you record and keep all your work, it's very easy to just look back over it to revise. 3 of them felt that the ELP was presenting activities through which they'd actually learn. It helps us because we draw pictures and write essays on French verbs and French items which help us to remember them. 3 of them thought it was fun. I find it useful because when I was working on the drawings and pictures at the back, I was learning French when having fun, which sadly is often not the case. There was one boy in the same teacher's class, which was a very low ability class, who was suspended from school for 2 weeks, I think for swearing at a teacher or something. And when he came back, the teacher was absolutely amazed that he had continued to work in his ELP, and he'd actually been in contact by phone with classmates to find out what they were doing so that he could do his bits. So the 5th one is interesting. It's not the textbook. It helps me to learn French as some people don't work 100% when working with the book all the time. So that the ELP will be different and it will make you speak French more. And then we said to them, well, do you think it's a good idea to set your own learning targets? And those who said yes, we then asked, well, why is it good? And 11 of them said that it made them feel more in control of their learning. It's good because we know what we can do and what we can't do, and we can concentrate on both when we want to. Things get done and I don't get sloppy. The teacher does not know what we want, so it's our job to tell her. There was also the idea that it made learning more enjoyable. If our teacher's telling us what to do and we don't like it, we'll just be dying for it to end. And if this is happening, we won't learn anything because we don't like it. 5 thought that it made learning easier. We can go at whatever pace we're able to go at, and we understand it much better, one of them told us. And finally, it's a better way of learning than using the textbook. I mean, the extent to which kids find textbooks boring, we often perhaps fail to notice. We wouldn't just be writing and reading out of the book all the time, one of them wrote. That ELP is used on a very small scale in Ireland. It came out of a particular project driven by these notions of learner involvement, learner reflection, target language use. It was, if you like, the implementation tool, the dissemination tool of our learner autonomy project. Since this pilot research was done, I've had a Greek PhD student working on a follow-up project. For 2 years we had, I think it was 20 teachers from 18 schools in the Greater Dublin area, and he collected an incredible amount of both statistical and qualitative data. So much so that his data collection runs to 6,000 pages. He's just finished his PhD, and it is to date by far the most wide-ranging but also profound empirical exploration of how the ELP works in particular, sometimes quite different and various school environments. And I'll say a little more about this at the end, but on your handout you've got a number of URLs, web addresses, and you can in fact look at the very extensive website that has grown out of this particular project.